You want the straight skinny? You want the real story? History in the Highway was made for you. True stories about real people and American tales right off the road. Sometimes from the blacktop, sometimes from the roadhouse, but always just as straight and true as chrome and steel. Throttle up, baby. This is History in the Highway. I'm standing in front of the American Museum of Natural History. This place is a veritable monument to Theodore Roosevelt. Inside, they've got many specimens that Roosevelt took on his hunts and safaris. Now, where would you think TR would be when President McKinley was shot? If you guessed the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, you'd be right. Roosevelt was taking advantage of how close he was to the primeval and pristine wilderness of the Adirondacks. But when he learned that after being shot, the president was in real danger of dying, Roosevelt hurried back to Buffalo, New York. When McKinley passed away 8 days later, Roosevelt was sworn in. He hurried back to Washington, D.C., where he famously became the standard by which all presidents ever since have been measured on all things foreign and domestic. But where Roosevelt really stands apart, actually stands above every other president, is in the conservation of America's wilderness heritage. Tell me, what is the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt as a conservationist?
What he did is show that conservation is not for wimps. It's for people who are willing to roll up their sleeves and go out and get dirty and make change, and that change is still going on today.
As president, Roosevelt would tour the parks of the West. Glacier, the Tetons, Yellowstone, Yosemite in California, the Badlands of the Dakotas, and Custer National Forest. Roosevelt would hunt the wilderness of the West. In fact, as president, Roosevelt once took a very large grizzly bear. When he brought him back for the taxidermy man, the taxidermist made the bear standing on all fours to make him look peaceful. Roosevelt was disappointed. He said to the taxidermist, "He looks like a hairy cow. Would you want to be remembered as a hairy cow?" The taxidermist redid the bear, stood him up at his full height with his claws extended, looking regal, like the king of the North that Roosevelt knew he was. Roosevelt would set aside better than 230 million acres as national parks, as wildlife preserves, as protected wilderness. That's more land than any president before or since combined. It might be Ulysses Grant that opened the first national park, Yellowstone, but it's Theodore Roosevelt that really got the ball rolling. In large part, the National Park Service owes its existence to Theodore Roosevelt. In 1904, Theodore Roosevelt would win the presidency in his own right. It's at this time that he becomes the trust buster. Now, it's not that he went out after all the trust. It's the trust that Roosevelt went after that are significant. You know, remember, Roosevelt's a hunter, and when he goes hunting, it's for big game. The trust he went after were the railroads owned by J.P. Morgan and Standard Oil owned by John D. Rockefeller. The Roosevelts, the Morgans, and the Rockefellers all ran in the same social circles. So Theodore Roosevelt is going out after his friends. Theodore Roosevelt was a man that always fought for what he believed was right. He wouldn't cut a political deal for his life. Just wasn't his way. Roosevelt's negotiating style was just this. Fellas, we're going to sit right here and we're going to keep talking until you see things my way. In 1906, he sent the American Navy out into the world to make a difference in international affairs and to put his particular thumbprint on foreign diplomacy. And in 1908, Roosevelt would retire from the presidency. He'd come home here to Sagamore Hill. Roosevelt would follow the precedent set by George Washington that no man needed that kind of power longer than 2 terms. Roosevelt found that the Taft administration had gone off the rails. William Howard Taft had betrayed most of the principles that Roosevelt had established. Taft had sided with the much more conservative part of the Republican Party. Roosevelt was furious. He decided right then and there, I'm running for president again. But most of the Republicans had already thrown their support behind Taft. So Roosevelt would have to run as an independent, the leader of a new party, a third party, the American Progressive Party. It's better known to history as the Bull Moose Party. Now, while campaigning in Wisconsin for the election in 1912, Roosevelt was shot in the chest. But the bullet passed through his glasses case and his folded over speech, which was so thick that it slowed the bullet to where Roosevelt wasn't seriously wounded. Roosevelt then stood before the crowd and said, "I don't know that you realize this, but I've just been shot." Then he said to the amazed people, "But it takes more than that to stop a bull moose." The crowd went wild. Theodore Roosevelt was one tough son of a gun. Roosevelt would come in second in that election. Woodrow Wilson would become the President of the United States. Roosevelt was adamantly opposed to Wilson's isolationist policies. He felt that the American nation should have gotten involved in the war much earlier than we did. When we finally did get involved in 1917, all four of Roosevelt's sons would volunteer for active duty overseas. His youngest son, Quentin, would be killed when he was shot down while flying a mission over German lines. Roosevelt's heart was broken. He would never recover. And in 1919, the great American lion, Theodore Roosevelt, would pass away. He was much more than an American president. He was the very essence of the American spirit.
Subscribe now. It's history with attitude and the American story with an edge.